Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Myth and Meaning, Episode 4, The First Night. This is a series where we talk about the myth and meaning of fictional endeavors. Particularly in this first season, we're talking about Dragon Ball. I'm your host on the left, Owl.
I'm your host on the right, Brock.
And like I said, today we're talking about the fall from paradise. Here in this, we have our two main characters, Goku and Bulma, leaving their stasis and leaving paradise itself to go adventure out and grow as a result.
Right, this is their transition into the world upon being given the knowledge of good and evil, as evidenced in the last episode by our snake guns.
That's right.
And being cast into the world by the angels. You had been talking to me a bit about your idea of angels before because we were listening to some Alan Watts.
Right, and in that Alan Watts, he says that angels fly because they take themselves lightly. And it's an explanation of what's going on here as well.
Right, there's this weight that you carry with you of the ego whenever you're self-conscious, right? There's shame. And you see that in Eve here, and that's why they clothe themselves in Genesis, because they're ashamed of their own nature, right?
And we're going to be talking about clothing in this episode, particularly, because of that very reason. So, I think we're good to continue on to talking about society and how society gives the power of protection to females by their nature.
Yeah, I like the way that it's introduced here too, because it's something that Bulma has with her capsules, and it opens us up to talk a little bit about capsules. It's going to come up more in the next few episodes as well. That it's something that she has inherited, right? You think about Capsule Corp and Bulma's father being an inventor who has passed down the technology of the capsules to her, and she has these capsules, and inside of the capsules is sort of this potential, you could say. And what we see in this episode is that she has, within the capsules, the potential to create a home, right? A home being this delineation between yourself and the nature around you.
Right, which goes into the idea of castles here, which is the protection of the familial unit in the, if you're talking about the royal family or you're talking about the societal familial unit, the women and children of the society are typically paramount in that unit. And so here we also see, and I pointed this, or I picked this picture out because of the foliage that's growing inside of the walls, is that walled garden representation. And Bluma is able to summon that at will.
Right. Now, the word paradise roughly translates into walled garden. I got that from Peterson, actually. But you think about that, the walled garden that is paradise and our expulsion from paradise, there's this sort of mirroring in the way that we have developed ourselves over time, that the paradise that we create is our own walled garden in a house, in creating the walls, delineating ourselves from the nature around us, creating a space to grow.
Well, it also goes into the idea that a man is the king of his own castle.
Right.
And in saying that, it is your own home. That idea has been expounded upon both in Eastern and Western cultures for the past, let's say, century and a half or so.
Oh, yeah.
And Toriyama, writing in this time, would be definitely aware of that. And that expansion of the individual familial unit in Japan during when he was writing Dragon Ball.
Yeah, no, it's definitely significant. It's not accidental that following the original interface and the introduction to the idea of evil to Goku, that the first thing that happens is Bulma takes her capsules and creates a house. I mean, at first it's just like, oh, that's convenient. Oh, the capsules are cool, but it's not accidental at all.
It's not that, because just after they interacted with a dragon of chaos, let's say, in the pterodactyl creature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the first response to that is, and that's the first response of really humanity when coming across this idea, is that, okay, we need to protect.
Right, there is chaos.
Yes.
What do we do about the chaos? We try to recreate paradise.
Yes.
And I think that's the myth of what's happening.
Well,
with this
that
episode.
actually happens in multiple myths as well. But right, and that's what's happening here. But
right.
So then we see Goku interact first, have his first real interactions between the masculine and the feminine, and his introduction to technology.
Yeah, it's interesting that his introduction to technology is also his introduction to the idea of matrimony, right? Of marriage between the masculine and the feminine.
Yeah, right. And I think it's poignant to say that it's the interface between the masculine and feminine that he's unaware of that really awakens him at this point. He doesn't know how to act around Bulma, and as a growing young man, he's impressionable towards this idea. However, he doesn't really interact with technology too much more. He tries to avoid it throughout the show. So we'll get into that at that point and
Definitely.
see how that changes someone who is impressed, let's say, by other pieces of media.
Impressionable, you could say.
Well, I'm particularly thinking about the very next frame where Bluma has like hearts in her eyes and things like that, and is totally encapsulated. It's the exact opposite.
Right. And I just thought it's funny, sort of the dichotomy here, where it's so early into the series we see Goku being shocked by it, and it's almost the same framing for at the end of the series whenever he inevitably gets with Chi-Chi. So I just had to throw it on there because it's just like he sees it.
It is. It's very it's like poetry, rhymes. And so then we have the whole bathroom scene and the discovery that the tail is real, and Bluma not believing that he has a tail.
Right, she's seen the tail, but she hasn't processed that he actually has a tail. She's like, oh, he's weird, and assumed that it was fake. And so we get to the bathing scene, and she tries to help him. He says, oh, I can scrub my back. And he takes the brush from her with his tail and cleans himself. He's self-sufficient in that way. And she comes to realize he really actually does have a tail. That it's a part of him, not just he's weird because he looks like he has a tail. I think that's really significant.
Right, but it also, and the reason I wanted this to be involved is the tale pertaining to Bulma is that air of mystery and that the depth of character that is inherent in having supernatural or otherwise inhuman traits. And so I wanted to put Edward Cullen here, or someone like him, because of that very reason, that is attractive to women, to have that. Even ancestral draw is probably the right. The hypergamous nature of women has that draw to the blood of the exceptional.
Sure. I mean, it's the manifestation of the bestial nature within man. That you have to manifest that to climb the hierarchy as such. And seeing the potential in Goku is something weird for her, because she's like, oh, this little boy has within him the potential to be a total animal, right?
A monster. Right. But she doesn't actually know.
And she actually has a line where she says, do all boys have tails?
Yeah.
And it's a great line, because it's sort of like she hasn't wrapped her head around what a boyfriend is yet. She knows that it's her wish, but she doesn't know what it means. And the whole beginning of this story is about her contextualizing what that means.
And it really is. I think it's a very important line, too, because it's a key part of what characterizes Bulma, and how Bulma herself is flawed.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this first season, and we'll get into it over the next few episodes of this, is about both how Bulma is flawed as the blooming female spirit, and what the opposite of that would look like with the blooming masculine spirit.
And we'll see that, yeah,
And
very
closing
soon.
the gap and seeing where the flaws exist and how we can overcome that to enable something great to come into the world.
Well, and what I wanted to mention besides the bestial nature of man is that ancestry, because for, let's say, a vampire to be a vampire, they have to have someone turn them into a vampire, right? And Goku, though she doesn't know it, that ancestral tie is really um, gonna be his source of strength, and we're gonna see that way later.
Hence the power pole and other things.
Right, as a precursor to it. So then, Bluma tries to feed Goku some coffee and bread and vegetables. What's the issue here, Brock?
I have a lot to say on this, and I'm going to try to get through it pretty quickly. So what happens in this scene is that Bulma tries to feed Goku bread, and Goku is not satisfied with that. He feeds himself and nourishes himself a specific way in nature, and he finds this to be wanting, so he leaves and goes to feed himself. And we've got a frame here of him fishing with his tail. Now, this is extremely significant for what Goku's character is for, I think, the entirety of the Dragon Ball saga. And I have a little bit here that I want to say about it. So, first of all, he leaves because he wants to nourish himself the way that he normally does. But now that he has come into contact with Bulma and been made aware of the nature of society, I believe he runs into Pilaf. Is that what happens? I can't remember exactly,
Yes,
but I think that
it is.
that's the precursor to that, but coming into his awareness, right?
Well, it's because, all right, before the first night, they have the encounter with the, let's say, the earthly dragon of chaos.
Right.
Right. Not Malice, not yet. And so when he does eventually get to this point, like you were saying, he encounters Pilaf because he is just. Yeah, he doesn't encounter Pilaf yet. He only encounters the homies. But he encounters them, right, because he goes to nourish himself. Kind of like you were saying.
It brings it into the fold, right?
Yeah.
And there's a causality to it, right? Because the escalating nature of the conceptualization of malice because of this self-consciousness, right, is coming into the story. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to say about that. The first thing about it is about fish and alchemy. So alchemical fish symbology is...
He doesn't actually fish. He eats like wolves and stuff, but go on.
Right. Well, it's the same idea, so I kind of wanted to bring it in right here to talk about something that's going to tie in a little bit more in the next couple of episodes as well with him. So there's this idea in alchemy about attracting fish to the surface of the water and what that means for the self. And so there's two different things. Number one, there is a recipe in alchemy where the slow cooking of a round fish, it's probably a jellyfish, but it's kind of obscured because of how old alchemical texts are, will form the coryllium, or the eyewash, of the philosophers, and if they were to wash their eyes with it, they would easily understand the secrets of philosophy. And then you've got the Book of Tobit, which is a Jewish text, I think like 2nd or 3rd century BCE, where somebody goes and extracts something from a fish, applies it to the eyes of the father, and restores his sight. So it's something that somebody can do whenever they take the fish from the water, right? The other thing is that in another alchemical text, the Echeneus, or the Remora, suctions itself into ships. And the alchemists projected onto the fish values, and they wanted to figure out how to get the fish up from the unconscious to the surface of the conscious, or up from the water to themselves. And so they became very focused on how to better themselves, to bring the fish to themselves and to the ship.
I see where you're getting with it.
And
right.
so there's this
It's
element,
Goku's desire to go and do that exact
and
process.
so it is the desire to feed himself and to be self-sufficient that he's embodying in bringing the fish to the surface. And the value in the fish is the thing that can be brought to bring, I would say, sight, right? And then that all ties into the biblical text with the quote, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Mouth of God being the unconscious, the fish that comes up from the unconscious. So I wanted to tie all that in real quick right here, because what he is doing by rejecting the bread is that thing, and that's what signifies what Goku is, not just to himself, but to the people around him as well.
Yeah, as the embetterment in the spirit of the individual. And so he runs into the homies, the false malevolence. And I put these pictures here particularly because they're emblematic of that exact idea. Honest John and the Cat and Pinocchio they're conmen, sure. They're deceitful, sure. They're arrogant, maybe, but they're not resentful. Same thing with Malfoy. Malfoy is arrogant. He's deceitful. He can lie, right? But he's not resentful. And just like that, these characters here, Shu, Mai, and Pilaf, they're arrogant, can be deceitful, but they're not resentful.
Right. This is a very baseline, simplistic sort of malice that we're seeing here.
Well, there's a reason why this malice precedes the malice that comes later.
Right, and we discussed a bit about sort of the Fool, right? I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Fool.
In a later episode,
and why Pilaf looks the way he does in that frame, right? He's almost like a jester in his own design.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that this iteration of that too is just superior. Like looking at Mai and Shu, I can take more meaning out of Mai and Shu than I could, say, Crab and Goyle, right? Like Mai and Shu representing something about Pilaf, that actually means something, right? And we'll get into that. But I don't think that Crab and Goyle mean much about Draco. So Goku encountering Mai and Shu, you can read into that and probably understand what that would mean about Pilaf. And I think we'll elucidate that in a later episode when we really get into Pilaf. But yeah,
but we gotta wait for the culmination.
But
of
that's what's so great about Dragon Ball,
right? And that is, but for now, we're just talking about the first iteration here of the fool's antagonist, right? The foolish antagonist. And so now we come to the part where we're talking about the removal of Blooma's modesty and what that means. And so the next night, Goku comes back from his interaction with the homies, and he sleeps with Blooma and finds that Blooma's a woman.
She doesn't have balls.
Where did her balls go?
Pretty shocked by that fact because he only knew his grandfather. And so he removes her panties, sees how she is. You can see that he's completely shocked. She doesn't understand exactly what's happened. She's been unconscious to what's happened here. But it has changed her as a character now. And I'm curious, we actually have staved off talking about the Titanic on this. I'm curious what you have to say about it.
So the reason I brought up the Titanic here is because it's the realization of Goku that Blooma is not like he is, and she's never going to be strong. He questions her about why she doesn't eat like the centipede he brings back and things like that. And this is the realization that there's a difference between the sexes. The reason I have the Titanic is because that was in a time when society recognized that there was a distinct difference. Men were chastised for staying or getting on the lifeboats before women and children during this point. Now it's not the same.
Right, and we live in a very equitable time.
Right, and the reflection here is exactly opposite of that. Not equitable, but separate.
The recognition of the difference.
And that's why I brought up the Titanic.
So on Goku's side, yes. Though there's something more significant happening with Bulma here. And
Yes.
and that is through her seeing Goku for the way that he is, she loses something about herself without being conscious of it.
Right, for losing respect. So that's the first step. She has these societal boons placed upon her that she takes for granted. We see her take her for granted, like the bicycle gets wrecked, the car gets wrecked. And then we see her denigrate the spirit of Goku when he goes out to find sustenance for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the first step in removing that societal protection. You no longer have access to that. You've lost that privilege.
Not only that, there's a claim to her modesty that she is good by her own interpretation of what good is. And Goku being sort of this embodiment of good in the way that he is, she no longer can interpret the way that she is as good as she thought it was. And she's shed a bit of her ignorance about herself through this interaction. And she doesn't know it yet. But I think that's sort of the meta level of what's happening here with Goku and removing her panties. It's like her claim to modesty, like I'm good as far as I understand the way the world is. And she witnesses Goku and no longer can think that logically, consciously.
Right, she can no longer rely on the social structures,
Right.
thought structures that she's built her beliefs on. And I think I want to talk more about Bluma in a future episode, particularly.
Oh, for sure.
And this, we're going to come back to this. And it's actually why I put the Titanic here, because the most pertinent information is about Goku, and the ripple effect that will come about from Bluma's interaction here is more sustaining. We need to talk about that over multiple episodes.
Oh, yeah. No, I just wanted to lay the groundwork because these are going to be some heady topics we get into.
It's true. And so that brings us to the end of episode 4, the first night. Do you have any final thoughts, Brock, before we sign off?
No, not really. Other than this episode is extremely dense. If you really want to get into it, I would say go over and look at our Get the Mic, because we could have probably talked about this episode for a couple of hours still, and we've already talked about it for a couple of hours. So it's a dense episode. We've tried to compact it down, but there's a lot to it.
All right, and I think we've done a pretty good job, but like Brock said, please check out our playlist of Get the Mic and the Get the Mic podcast. We've done the first 13 episodes of season 1. If you want to check out any of those, please subscribe and smash the like button.
Obliterate it.
Owl out.